The canal diggers of China's grand infrastructure. Mud, sweat, and the early stages of the Grand Canal. If you were to stand along the flat riverbanks of eastern China in the 6th century, you would find yourself surrounded not by silence, but by the sound of countless men, women, and even animals, straining to move earth one handful at a time. The Grand Canal, as you know it today, is an immense feat of human labor, a waterway stretching more than 1,000 miles, linking the fertile south to the political centers in the north. But its origins were far less grand than the title implies. In its earliest stages, it was little more than a long, muddy ditch, widened and deepened with baskets, wooden shovels, and calloused hands. A canal of necessity. China's geography made such an enterprise inevitable. The Yellow River in the north flooded often, devastating crops and villages with its sudden bursts of destructive force. The Yangtze in the south, however, was relatively stable and nourished fertile lands that produced abundant rice. Moving rice northward, especially to feed the armies and officials clustered around the northern capitals, was essential. Ox carts were too slow, foot caravans too fragile, and existing river systems too fragmented. A canal promised a reliable, controllable artery for food and goods. By the late 6th century, the Sui dynasty, 581 to 618 CE, had taken this dream and forced it into reality. Emperor Yang of Sui envisioned a project not simply of transport, but of political unity. Linking north and south through water meant more than moving rice. It meant stitching together diverse regions under one administrative hand. Yet while the imperial scribes framed the canal in terms of vision and prosperity, the men with their feet in the mud understood it differently. For them, it was back-breaking toil, measured in blisters, mud-caked bodies, and long days that blurred into endless seasons. Drafted into labor, the earliest diggers of the canal did not come willingly. They were peasants drafted through the corvée labor system, summoned by local magistrates, and marched away from their fields. Some were gone for months, others for years. Families were split apart, villages left half empty. Imagine being pulled from your rice paddy at the start of planting season, only to be told you would spend the year carrying baskets of mud for the emperor's project hundreds of miles away. Records speak of tens of thousands at a time conscripted. They worked in brigades, each assigned a section of ditch, overseen by stern officials who measured progress not in kindness, but in the pace of excavation. Whips were carried, though not always used. The very threat was enough when men were already exhausted. Tools were simple. Iron spades cut into clay, but many laborers made do with wooden shovels that splintered quickly. Bamboo baskets served to haul the dirt away, sometimes slung between two men on poles. A team could remove only a few feet of soil in a day, and when faced with rocky layers, progress slowed to a crawl. The dig was not a straight line. Bends had to be cut, embankments reinforced, and existing waterways joined carefully. Living conditions on the canal line. For those digging, survival was as much a challenge as the work itself. Camps were set up along the trench. often little more than huts of straw or rough tents patched together from cloth. Food was meager, rice gruel if they were lucky, often mixed with millet or whatever scraps could be procured locally. Meat was rare, vegetables occasional, and illness frequent. Waterborne diseases spread easily. Mosquitoes bred in stagnant pools of unfinished canal cuts, and dysentery plagued the labor camps. Death was not uncommon, and bodies were sometimes buried hastily along the canal's edge, their markers crude wooden posts or nothing at all. And yet, day after day, the work continued. Overseers recorded quotas, and failure to meet them invited harsh punishment. Stories circulated of men who collapsed at their posts and were simply replaced by others, the work uninterrupted. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but the impersonal demand of a project too vast to stop for individuals. The human chain. One of the more remarkable features of the early canal construction was the human chain. Imagine a line of hundreds of men passing baskets of earth from hand to hand, dumping them on embankments that slowly grew higher with each day's effort. Voices called out to keep rhythm. Chants echoed across the dig sites, and the line moved like a living conveyor belt. Such chains were not only efficient, but also necessary when mud was too slippery for carts or animals. Workers learned to move in unison, and though they rarely did so by choice, the rhythm of work sometimes gave them a strange sense of shared endurance. Songs were sung, often quietly, carrying words of longing for home, for wives and children left behind. Supervision and scale. Overseeing all of this were the magistrates and imperial officials who reported progress back to the capital. They traveled with guards and scribes, sometimes with engineers who studied the soil and charted the course of the ditch. Records from the time reveal the bureaucratic obsession with measurements. The width of the channel, the slope of the banks, the daily tally of workers. To the emperor, numbers on a parchment represented order and achievement. To the men in the mud, those numbers represented endless repetition. One more foot dug, one more day endured. The scale of the project was staggering. In some areas, tens of thousands dug simultaneously. When one section was completed, the workforce shifted north or south, marching in long columns with their tools slung over their shoulders. Villages along the canal route were disrupted as thousands of strangers passed through, consuming local resources and often leaving resentment in their wake. Impact on families and villages. For the families left behind, canal labor meant hardship. Fields went untended, harvests diminished, and women carried the burden of keeping villages alive in the absence of their men. Taxes still had to be paid, even when the very hands that grew the crops were gone. Some communities tried to hide men from the draft, disguising them or sending them into forests, but officials were relentless. Avoidance risked collective punishment, and so most submitted. The canal, though intended to feed the empire, sometimes starved the very people building it. Grain shipments moved northward, feeding armies in the imperial court, while villages along the canal line waited for their own share that often never came. A canal of contradictions. And yet, Despite the hardship, there was a strange pride in the work. Workers, when they returned, could point to a stretch of canal and say, "That ditch, that bank, I dug it." Villages claimed small sections as their own contribution to the empire. Some families kept stories alive for generations of grandfathers who labored on the first cuts of the Grand Canal. The contradiction is difficult to ignore. For the emperor, the canal was a triumph of unity and control. For the workers, it was a trial of survival and endurance. And yet, without them, the artery of China would never have flowed. Closing of Section 1. As the first muddy trenches deepened, as sweat mingled with clay, and as thousands of lives bent under the demand of empire, the Grand Canal took its first halting breaths. It was not yet the polished, bustling waterway of later centuries, but something raw, painful, and undeniably human. One cannot help but ask, did the men digging those first trenches know they were building something that would last for centuries? Or did it feel to them like nothing more than a ditch in the mud, the lifeline of rice and revenue? When the first muddy trenches of the Grand Canal were joined together into a continuous waterway, the project shifted from an act of sheer excavation into one of maintenance, management, and movement. The Sui emperor who had ordered the massive undertaking declared it a triumph of imperial will. But for the ordinary people of China, it was not simply an abstract political symbol. It became a part of their daily lives, altering how food moved, how taxes were collected, and how villages experienced both prosperity and burden. The Grand Canal was no longer just a ditch in the earth. It was a flowing artery through which rice, taxes, soldiers, and even gossip coursed. Its existence reshaped the empire not in days, but in seasons, years, and generations. The flow of grain. Rice was at the heart of the canal's purpose. Southern China, especially the Yangtze Basin, was a rice bowl of astonishing fertility. Fields, when properly flooded and managed, could yield multiple harvests a year, feeding far more people than the drier millet fields of the north. With the canal completed, barges could be loaded with rice sacks in Hangzhou or Suzhou and sent northward, guided by poles and the labor of boatmen, all the way to the political capitals near the Yellow River. The logistics were monumental. Local officials oversaw the collection of grain taxes in the south, often taken directly from farmers in kind rather than coin. That rice was stored in large government granaries along the canal, guarded carefully against both theft and rot. When the order came, granaries were opened, and laborers transferred the sacks onto low, wide boats built for heavy cargo. These were not sleek vessels of war or elegant river craft. They were plain, wooden barges, often painted only with tar to protect the wood. Some could carry many tons at a time. Movement was slow. A barge might advance only a few miles in a day, depending on the current, wind, and manpower. Oars and poles were used in the shallows, and along many stretches, teams of men and animals walked the towpaths, pulling the boats against the current with thick ropes. Imagine the scene. A line of men straining forward on muddy embankments, their shoulders harnessed, as the boat creaked and lurched upstream, piled high with sacks of rice. It was a procession of necessity, repeated over and over through the centuries. Towpaths and the labor of movement. Towpaths themselves became as significant as the waterway. Cut into the banks of the canal, they were sometimes little more than dirt trails, other times reinforced with stones to prevent erosion. These paths were worn smooth by endless feet, hooves, and wooden sandals. Along them, teams of laborers marched in rhythm, pulling barges day after day. Life as a towman was as grueling as that of the original ditch diggers. Men bent forward, ropes biting into their shoulders, feet slipping in mud when the rains came. In summer, the heat radiated off the canal, turning the air thick with humidity and mosquitoes. In winter, ice could form along the banks, making every step dangerous. Towmen often sang chants to keep rhythm, short phrases repeated endlessly to synchronize the pull. The sound of these voices carried across the water, merging with the splash of poles and the creak of wood. Barges were guided by boatmen shouting instructions, and children too sometimes joined, their small bodies roped in alongside their fathers. It was not glamorous work, nor well paid, but it was steady and necessary. Granaries and storage. The canal also gave rise to vast granaries, which became some of the most important buildings in the empire. These storage facilities were typically large, square structures, raised on stone platforms to keep the grain dry. Roofs of tile or thatch sheltered the precious cargo from rain, and thick walls guarded against rodents. Officials inspected the grain regularly, and soldiers were stationed nearby to ensure no theft. Granaries had a strange presence in local life. For peasants who toiled in the fields, the grain they had grown and surrendered often sat locked behind walls they could not access, destined for distant mouths in the capital. It was a visible reminder that much of their labor served the empire more than themselves. Yet, in times of famine, those same granaries could save lives when the government decided to distribute emergency rations. Villages near granary towns saw both opportunity and burden. Merchants arrived to sell goods to soldiers and officials, and sprang up for travelers, and markets bustled with activity. But those same villages bore the weight of housing large administrative staff and often had to support the endless flow of canal workers passing through. The movement of officials. It was not only rice that traveled the canal. Officials used it as a highway, moving from one post to another in relative comfort compared to overland routes. Their boats were often modest but distinct from the heavy rice barges. They might carry small canopies to shield from the sun, or even painted decorations to mark their rank. For the people watching from the banks, the passage of an official's boat was both ordinary and remarkable. Ordinary, because such traffic became common as the canal matured. Remarkable, because it symbolized the distant state made visible, floating down their local waterway. Children might wave from the embankment, while elders muttered about taxes, labor quotas, and the never-ending demands of the bureaucracy. Villages along the water. The canal reshaped the geography of habitation. Settlements that once were isolated found themselves sitting on the empire's busiest highway. Inns, tea houses, repair shops for boats, rope makers, and smiths all flourished along the banks. Some villages expanded into towns, then into cities, their prosperity tied directly to the flow of canal traffic. Yet, prosperity was not evenly shared. Smaller villages often bore the demands of housing conscripted laborers, repairing damaged towpaths, or surrendering food for passing travelers. In times of heavy traffic, local resources could be depleted. The water that promised abundance also threatened to overwhelm. For families living along the canal, life developed a rhythm shaped by the passage of barges. Children grew up with the sight of long lines of towmen trudging past, their chants echoing. Markets filled on days when granary stores were opened. Travelers brought news of distant regions, news that otherwise might have taken months to arrive. The cost of maintenance. A canal of such size was never finished. Even after the initial excavation, work crews were continually employed to dredge silt, repair embankments, and rebuild locks. Siltation was a constant enemy. The Yellow River in particular carried immense amounts of sediment, and sections of the canal connected to it had to be cleared frequently. Dredging was itself a form of corvée labor. Teams of peasants were summoned, their tools little improved from those used in the first digging. Wooden scoops, baskets, and poles formed the basis of dredging equipment. Sometimes, men entered the water itself, scooping mud by hand or pushing it with long shovels. Floods posed another challenge. Heavy rains could cause the banks to collapse, swallowing fields and homes along with them. Villagers living nearby often built their houses on slightly raised platforms, knowing that water might rise suddenly. The sound of rushing water in the night was a constant fear, a web of control. To the imperial government, the canal was not only an artery of grain, but also an artery of control. Taxes were easier to collect when goods could be moved efficiently. Troops could be dispatched quickly to regions of unrest. Communication between North and South accelerated, with dispatch boats carrying messages faster than overland couriers. But such control came with resentment. Many peasants viewed the canal not as a gift, but as another imposition of the state. They knew its construction had cost countless lives, and its operation drew grain away from their communities. The canal might bring goods in return, but it was clear that its primary function was to serve the capital and the emperor's court. At times, anger boiled into rebellion. Some uprisings in later centuries cited the heavy burden of canal labor and grain taxation as causes. The very artery that nourished the empire also revealed its fractures, the human side of traffic. Despite the imperial scale, the canal was also intensely human. Boatmen became a distinct group, with their own traditions, songs, and reputations. Some were seen as rough and unruly, others as skilled navigators who knew every bend and current. Towmen developed a culture of endurance, marked by camaraderie, forged in endless toil. Travelers wrote of encounters along the canal, merchants boasting of profits, monks journeying to distant temples, soldiers returning home. Each had their own perspective, but all relied on the waterway. Imagine standing on the bank, watching a slow procession of barges, some piled high with grain, others carrying bundles of firewood, clay jars of oil, or even livestock. The smell of tar, sweat, and wetwood filled the air. Shouts carried across the water as men called instructions, while children splashed along the banks. It was mundane, yet it represented a transformation in how people lived, ate, and connected. By the time the Grand Canal became fully operational, it was no longer just a ditch forced through the earth by conscripted peasants. It was the central artery of an empire, pumping rice northward, wealth outward, and control downward from the throne. Villages were altered, lives redirected, economies reshaped. And yet, for all its vastness, it remained fragile, dependent on constant labor, vulnerable to floods, and resented by those forced to maintain it. One cannot help but wonder, did the very artery that bound the empire together also carry the seeds of its discontent, waiting for the day when the burden outweighed the benefit? Legacy along the water. The Grand Canal, born of sway ambition and shaped by endless toil, endured far longer than its originators could have imagined. While dynasties rose and fell, the waterway continued its slow, silent function, a constant amidst political upheaval. It outlasted emperors, survived invasions, and witnessed centuries of change. In its persistence lies its true story, not one of momentary glory, but of long, grinding endurance. Tang Dynasty, Canal, and Court. When the Sui dynasty collapsed under the weight of overambition, it seemed possible that the canal would fall into disrepair. Yet the Tang dynasty, which followed, recognized its value immediately. The Tang court leaned heavily on the canal for the transfer of grain and taxes. By this time, the canal system of locks and channels was refined. The Tang capital of Chang'an, though westward, benefited indirectly. Supplies for Luoyang, another administrative hub, passed northward along the canal, stabilizing the dynasty's political heart. In Chang'an's great markets, southern rice appeared in stalls alongside silks, ceramics, and exotic imports from the Silk Road. None of that abundance would have been possible without the steady stream of barges from the south. For merchants, the canal became as important as the desert caravan routes, if not more so, because it was dependable in ways the Silk Road could never be. Song Dynasty, the Golden Rice Route. If the Tang relied upon the canal, the Song Dynasty refined it further. By the Song period, southern China had become not only the rice basket, but the economic center of the empire. The canal's role expanded accordingly, ensuring that grain taxes, collected in vast quantities, could reach the northern capitals at Kaifeng and later Hangzhou. Song records detail the exacting bureaucracy that monitored canal transport. Officials counted sacks meticulously, monitored granaries, and logged every shipment. They established fixed quotas for regions and tracked whether villages met their obligations. It was a system at once efficient and oppressive. Canal towns during this era flourished. Hangzhou, in particular, linked directly to the canal's southern reaches, grew into a magnificent city. Its tea houses, gardens, and bustling streets were described by foreign visitors in awe. The prosperity visible there was inseparable from the barges creaking northward, laden with rice. Yuan dynasty, Mongol riders, canal barges. When the Mongols swept into China and established the Yuan dynasty, they faced the challenge of ruling a vast, sedentary civilization with their own nomadic traditions. The canal became an unlikely solution to their logistical needs. The Yuan rulers shifted the capital northward to Balik, today's Beijing. That position demanded immense quantities of grain from the south, and only the canal could provide it reliably. Thus, during the Yuan period, the canal was extended further north, linking more directly to the new capital. Yuan dynasty, Mongol riders, canal barges. When the Mongols swept into China and established the Yuan dynasty, they faced the challenge of ruling a vast, sedentary civilization with their own nomadic traditions. The canal became an unlikely solution to their logistical needs. The Yuan rulers shifted the capital northward to Balik, today's Beijing. That position demanded immense quantities of grain from the south, and only the canal could provide it reliably. Thus, during the Yuan period, the canal was extended further north, linking more directly to the new capital. Imagine the irony. Mongol horsemen, conquerors of steppes, depending on creaking wooden barges pulled by laborers through mud to feed their court. The canal became their lifeline, binding the southern rice fields to the northern steppe city. Ming Dynasty, repairs and rebellions. The Ming Dynasty inherited the canal in a state of disrepair after the tumult of the Yuan's decline. Early Ming emperors ordered massive renovation projects. Locks were rebuilt, embankments shored up, towpaths repaired. At one point, tens of thousands of workers were again conscripted to dredge and restore silted channels. By the Ming period, Beijing had become the enduring capital. Its location far to the north meant that the canal's role grew ever more critical. Each year, immense quantities of rice were shipped along its waters to feed the city and its garrisons. But with such reliance came unrest. The canal was also vulnerable. Banditry sometimes flared along towpaths. Floods destroyed embankments. Even small disruptions could ripple into shortages in the capital. Peasant rebellions occasionally erupted along the canal routes, citing the burdens of forced labor and the unfair extraction of resources. One of the most enduring ironies of the Ming is that while the Forbidden City rose in splendor, much of its sustenance was made possible by men trudging along muddy towpaths hundreds of miles away. Qing Dynasty, bureaucracy on water. By the Qing period, canal administration reached a kind of bureaucratic perfection. The empire's officials established a sophisticated system of checkpoints, with inspectors stationed at major locks to verify cargo. Reports moved up the hierarchy as steadily as the rice itself moved northward. The Qing invested heavily in canal infrastructure, but they also faced growing challenges. As global trade began to expand in the 17th and 18th centuries, maritime routes became increasingly important. Coastal shipping competed with canal transport, especially when silting or floods disrupted inland movement. Still, the canal retained prestige. It was to control the empire's stomach. And so it remained a focal point of both state power and vulnerability. Life along the canal, enduring rhythms. Across all these dynasties, the daily life of canal workers changed little. Towmen continued to lean into their ropes, trudging along the same paths as their forebears. Boatmen still shouted commands and sang chants. Granaries were filled and emptied again. Families grew up along the water, their lives tied to the slow passage of barges. Inns offered cheap lodging to travelers, their walls smoky from years of candlelight. Blacksmiths mended tools. Rope makers twisted fibers into the thick cords that stretched from barge to towpath. Even festivals adapted. Lantern festivals along canal towns lit up the water's surface with flickering reflections. Barges paused, their crews mingling with villagers before resuming their endless march. The canal was not just infrastructure. It was landscape, community, and memory, declined in the modern age. By the 19th century, the canal's importance waned. Western powers introduced new trade routes by sea, and railroads began to penetrate the Chinese interior. These were faster, less labor-intensive, and less vulnerable to floods. Maintenance of the canal declined. Sections fell into disrepair. Where once towmen had trudged, weeds grew. Villages that had thrived on canal commerce dwindled as traffic shifted elsewhere. Yet, even in decline, parts of the canal continued to function. Local transport persisted, and some stretches remained in use for grain shipments well into the 20th century. In recent decades, restoration projects have sought to preserve it as a cultural monument. Reflections on legacy. The Grand Canal is today recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, celebrated for its sheer scale and historical significance. But its legacy is not simply architectural or geographical. It lies in the countless lives spent digging, pulling, loading, and guarding. It represents the paradox of empire, the ability to bind vast territories together through infrastructure, but only at immense human cost. For every emperor who boasted of its grandeur, there were thousands of peasants whose backs bent under the weight of mud or rope. And yet, without it, the history of China might look very different. Could the northern capitals have flourished without southern rice? Could dynasties have lasted as long without such a dependable artery? The canal helped sustain an empire not for decades, but for more than a millennium. Stand on the bank of the canal today, perhaps in a quiet town where the water still flows. You see reflections ripple in the brown-green surface. You hear echoes of history in the silence. The chants of towmen, the creak of barges, the clatter of granary doors. The canal is still there, an old scar across the land, a memory etched into earth and water. Its legacy is not grandeur, but endurance. And one wonders, was the canal truly a triumph of empire, Or was it a monument to the unending labor of ordinary people who gave their strength so that others might eat?